This was started by your grandfather, is that correct?
Correct.
Can you describe to people what the defining mission was of this particular sect, cult, why it was started, what they believed, what the guiding principles were, so people get a feel for what defined this particular ideology?
Wouldn't say that I could entirely speak for my grandfather. Nothing was written down. He did everything charismatically, and he was very mercurial. But my understanding, and this part I know is historically accurate, that by 1931, they were being written up in the newspaper as a boys' organization that was going up to the mountains, which would later become where I was raised, and that he used to be a Boy Scout leader, that he left the Boy Scouts in order to have more influence over the boys that he led. And so from 1931 until sometime in the 1960s, it was really a all male organization, and no one was allowed to marry and nobody had children. So the men who were there were ostensibly, or at least theoretically, celibate, and they were just all men for decades. And then my mother was his fourth child, his first girl. And in the 1960s, I think, decided, since the world hadn't ended and he said it was going to end in the 1970s, that he needed to make sure she got married. And so he married her off to to his main lead man, who was my father. And I think my grandfather's ideology was that he was building the army of God. And he believed that God called him to be the next prophet, kind of like Muhammad or Elijah. He used to quote Elijah a lot, and he believed that he would be 500 years old and that he would lead in the army to fight in Armageddon.
How did they survive? You said that they lived off the land. You, in fact, were trained. This was a big part of it. You were trained on how to survive off the land, what plants were edible and not edible, and that sort of thing. Did any of these people work outside of this compound? Did they go away and work in town and come back? Did they buy things? How did they get by?
So there were many different iterations of this organization. When my parents didn't work outside at all, ever. But my parents were really central leaders. So the main, fellowship of this organization was boys mostly. And later there were some girls, like during my era, but it was children whose families basically wanted to hand their children over to this collective. I happened to have my parents there, but most people did not. And so their parents worked outside of the organization. The kids themselves only worked inside the organization. And the only way you could ever become a leader or fully vested in what they would never call a cult, but we'll call the organization, the only way you could be vested in the organization is to have been raised there since usually the age of 6 or 7, if you weren't born there, which a few of us were.
Certainly they didn't call themselves a cult. No cult ever calls themselves a cult. But how did they refer to themselves?
So there was a couple words. To outsiders, we called ourselves members. So we were members of the field. The field was the term that all the insiders used. Outside the organization, it was originally called Boys Christian League, but nobody referred to it as that. They called it BCL, but all the inside people never called it BCL. They always called it the field. And the boys who were at the field wanted to grow up to be in the army of God, and they wanted to be separate and different than their parents. Parents were vilified, but parents often contributed financially to this organization. It's kind of like sending your boys to a monastery or something, and you want to support the monastery, but you don't need to know what goes on inside of it. I'm not saying it's equal to that. I'm saying that it's similar in the sense that once you're inside, you're not allowed to tell your family what you're doing. In my case, my family was there, but everyone else who joined, it was like this, you answered to God, and God became, well, at least their version of God, right? Like their version of God became the central abiding principle, which really only my grandfather could interpret. So he would tell you what God was saying, and you would choose to believe it or you would get excommunicated.
Right now today, if somebody snapped you up and parachuted you into a giant forest somewhere, you would be particularly equipped to survive. Fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, I would be more equipped than the average person by far, sure.
What would you be able to do? How would you survive? You know what to eat, not eat, how to find, what would you do? What do you know that other people don't know?
I'm sure some people know this, but the average person, I would say, would panic. And the number one thing that I would be able to do, and I know this is true, I mean, I just feel like I have to close my eyes just to like show you that it would be like, I would completely sit and feel what it's around me. And I would start breathing with the forest. I would start seeing the forest as my friend rather than an enemy. I would not try to survive the forest. I would try to befriend the forest and ask what I could do or learn or see to be provided for. I think the biggest things in survival situations is when you panic or you think you have to go and make something happen, you don't sometimes see the I guess supplies, like the literal access that you have to nourishment. So I would also do something my mom taught us to do, which is in her language, survive fear, survive with faith. So the first thing I would do is seek shelter, like just in pragmatic terms. And I would not panic. And then I would look for what I am a place for shelter. So just like real estate, it's location, 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 like where you put your shelter is the most important thing. So if you're not panicking, you give yourself an hour to sort of look around. I wouldn't go too far from where I landed because I would think that it's possible someone would come back to rescue me. But I would look for high ground that's not an animal trail. I would be near water, but not on water. If I could find it, I would go through all that. And then next, try to figure out warmth, because unless you're smack in the middle of the summer, and even then sometimes, if you can't keep yourself warm at night, hypothermia is like the first thing that's going to take you out. So I would work on fire, and then I would think about signaling if I wanted to be rescued. And if I was in hiding, I would very clearly remove all aspects of signaling. And I know very well how to do that either way. And then I would look for a water source if I hadn't already found one in relation to shelter. And then, and only then, after I'd done all that, and probably not until the next day, would I start to look at food sources. And I would start with plant resources. You have a lot better chance of not having issues with the environment around you if you know how to eat the plants. I'm not saying I would never eat. I would fish if that was available, but I probably would not start by killing animals at all. I don't think that would be for the best food source in the long run. Quite honestly, you can exhaust yourself trying to figure out how to chase creatures.
Yeah. And you know what to eat and what not to eat.
Yes, I know way more than the average person, but it is regional. I would know how to survive in the Angeles National Forest. And I am currently spending a lot of time in the San Bernardino Mountains, and I'm learning a lot about that. So I would know how to survive there too. If I was dropped somewhere I didn't know, I know how to at least a little bit understand toxicity in terms of smell. I know how to taste something and wait. Like if I didn't know what a plant was, I could wait. There's certain things I wouldn't mess with, like certain mushrooms if I didn't know, because if you eat the wrong mushroom, you can die. Most other plants, it's only if you eat too much that you could die. So if I didn't really know a plant, I would know some identifying characteristics that would be likely to be beneficial versus toxic. And then I would take them in super, super small doses and keep track. I know how to do this in the dirt. Like if I didn't have any paper, I know how to mark things, and you'd put the actual plant and you would put you'd mark the little. You can do kind of from the sun angles, like you would know what time that you took it, and you would wait 12 hours, because if you didn't have any reaction in 12 hours, then you could eat more of that. And I would keep track of all that. It's better to be hungry for a month than it is to eat something that is going to dehydrate you or cause you to lose nutrients by vomiting. So you have to be really careful about that. And I think I would have the patience, and this is something a lot of people wouldn't know how to do. I don't know if you would know how to do this, but to not just say, I need to eat, but say, no, not eating is the least of my problems right now. I need to find out what is safe for me here and learn to be in relationship with it. And then, if you know what's safe, you can continue to eat, which is much more important.
Yeah. And you have to have water. How do you know if water is safe to drink?
Well, running water usually is. And what's not safe is if you're around humans. So if you're around humans, you would probably just walk to the humans. But you would look for a water source that was running water. If you don't have running water, you're going to have to distill it. People hike with systems where they put in pills or something. If you had all that, you would obviously, clean your water. The deeper you dig down into the earth, the cleaner the water is. So it's not going to be defiled if you can manage to find a water source, also called a water table. So maybe if you go down a foot, even. So sometimes, I don't know if when people are building, they do vertical wells in places that don't have a lot of water and horizontal wells in places that are water rich. So if you were in a place where you could basically do a horizontal well, you wouldn't have to go down that far, and you would kind of just clear out the water table. And in a sense, you're making a pond. And the deeper you go down into that, the better choice you have of it not being hostile to you. That being said, most water sources that kill you in foreign countries and things have to do with the microbes and the things that are related to the human population that has defiled it.
Homeowners, when's the last time you checked on your home title? If your answer is never, then this is for you. Scammers are stealing titles and your equity is the target. Criminals forge your signature, and just like that, your home title can be transferred out of your name. That's why I partnered with Home Title Lock, so you can find out today if you're already a victim. Use my promo code Phil at HometitleLock.com and you'll get a free title history report. Plus, you'll get a free trial of their $1 million triple lock protection. That's 24/7 monitoring of your title. Urgent alerts to any changes, and if fraud does happen, they'll spend up to $1 million to fix it. That's HometitleLock.com, promo code Phil. I talk to people sometimes with, kids that they've been raised by members of the KKK or some extreme group or whatever, and they say, my God, how can those kids have such hate, and how can they say the things they say? And I always remind people, if that's all they've ever known, if that's all they've ever heard, people write on the slate of who those children are. And if the only people that have ever written on that slate write hate and write the things that they write on the slate of who those children are, they have nothing to compare it to. They have no idea that that is toxic. And you were in a situation like that, and you were programmed very much to prepare for the end of times, and raised by a collective and not had the kind of bonding that people typically have, relationship formation that people typically have. But you started to think your way out of that. How do you explain that you found a way to start to question what was being written on the slate of who you are? What was your reference point, and how did you start to question?
I was the fourth child born into this organization, but I was the second in my biological family. And so at the very beginning of this, they didn't know how to educate us because they had never raised children. And they sent us to public school at the very beginning. My older sister went to school for 4 years. I went to school for 3 years. My little sister went to school for 1 year. And I think that public school really gave me a foundation. I was a quick learner. I learned to read in kindergarten. And so I got to go all the way through second grade. And in the book Voyager, I discussed that for whatever reason, I was put in this gifted program. And so I was given some tools in first and second grade. So like a 6 and 7-year-old map making, for example. I don't know if this was a very specific teacher who cared about this, but this particular teacher taught us how to map the area of the school and then to think about mapping where we live by the proximity of what's important in our community. And he had no idea I was raised in a cult. We were taught not to talk about anything about where we came from. But I learned to think specifically spatially and to think about how this school existed outside. So I think it was a huge deal. We moved up to the mountain just at the end of when I was 7, like right before I turned 8. And then I didn't have any of this kind of thing again. But that really early childhood education, just in a regular public school in El Monte School District, and they stopped doing that, like obviously because you can learn all sorts of coping mechanisms that aren't helpful in a cult. But that was super influential to me.
You said once you hit your teenage years, you said you started to question the contradictions and the hypocrisies that you observed, because this was supposedly such a godly thing, but yet you were abused. You were physically abused, sexually abused, neglected. You said you recorded those doubts in the only secular book that you had, which was the Sears catalog, which is an interesting use for a Sears catalog. What kind of things were you writing down? And this is a form of journaling, obviously. And did you go back to that and look at it on a regular basis? Because that's a fascinating way to start creating a history. And I've always said, thinking about things, that's one level. of analysis, but to write them down creates objectivity. So you can go back and look at it a week later, a month later, 3 months later, and it creates some concreteness and some objectivity that grounds it for you. That's so important to do, and it's amazing to me that you had the insight to do that at that young age. I'd love to hear more about what you were writing down and what kind of clarity that created for you.
When I was 7, there was a fire in the camper that we were living in or staying in, and when we were traveling around proselytizing. And we didn't have a home at that point. Our nuclear family had lost our home. And so our dog died in the fire, and every single belonging I had in the world disappeared in that fire. And we went up to the mountain, and my dad's mom, who lived on the East Coast and she was not involved in the cult, sent us something from the Sears catalog to pick up so that we would have something to wear because we had no clothes. And the woman at it was a round building that was, I guess, where you'd go and pick up things from Sears. We picked up our clothes, and she gave me the catalog, and I hid it because I knew my family wouldn't want me to have it. And I hid it in the mountains. So I wasn't reading it regularly because I had to sneak away to get access to the Sears catalog. But I did know how to write because I'd been to school before that, and I didn't go back to school at that point. They did educate us in the organization down at the field, but that's a little more complicated because it wasn't like education in the way that you think of education. But in any case, I wrote down things from the Bible because that is the one book that I had access to. And my grandfather, who was this really fire and brimstone preacher, I don't even know if he was reading the Bible. Like, I really don't. I sometimes question if he even knew how to read, but he was quoting things from his head or something. I'm sure he was very intelligent, but that I didn't think were true, and I couldn't find them in the Bible. So I'd use my dad's Bible and then my mom's Bible. And so when I turned 8, I promised myself I would read every word of the Bible before I turned 9. And so I would borrow my parents' Bibles, and we had the King James version. So that's kind of a complicated, language. It's Shakespearean language, or like what we would call Shakespearean language from the same era. And I read the entire Bible, cover to cover, word for word. And I started marking anything that seemed like a contradiction between what was written in the Bible and what I was hearing my grandfather speak. And we had to listen to my grandfather all the time. Like, he preached every day. Like, we had to just constantly hear him. And so I just started noticing the contradictions, and I would ask my mom, and she would deny them, or now we might call it gaslighting, but I think she was so indoctrinated, she didn't know, she was just like, she just told me to be quiet and not to ask those questions. And I felt like everyone I asked in the organization told me I was wrong. And so I just stopped talking. I feel like I maybe in fact, all the people who come back and tell me, like, you were so quiet, we didn't even know you had a voice. I think I stopped talking probably when I was 8. I don't think I really spoke much between 8 and then probably 13. And so I wrote everything down in the book. And then when my grandfather gave me a copy of the Bible, which is really beautiful that he gave me that, I started writing in the Bible itself. And they would have considered that sacrilege. So I didn't tell them I wrote in the Bible, but I started making notes of stories in the Bible that contradicted other versions of story in the Bible. And I guess I started thinking at a very young age, for sure by the time I was 9, that there's such a thing as perspective, and that assuming, because I thought it was all the word of God, assuming that it's the word of God, I was like, oh, but humans are the one telling the stories, and humans see this from different perspectives. And then I started noticing everyone around me and started thinking about how they're telling a story from a different perspective. So I think I became really aware of storytelling by the time, probably easily by the time I was 10. And then I started trying to create a narrative that could end differently for me than the one I was told was my fate.
The tool of the cult is they have to blunt any other relationship because it's a threat to their primacy, to their omnipotence. Because anything, if you're allowed to bond with your parents, if you're allowed to bond with a pet, even intellectually with a philosopher or another mindset, that's a threat to the cult leadership. So they have to blunt all of that, right? If you are able to build self-worth, if you're able to build a self-image, that's a threat to their control and their omnipotence. So they have to create complete dependency and undermine everything else with self-doubt. So that's why they have to do that. And they understand that really early on, because any independence, any critical thinking, any self-thought is a threat to their control. So that's why they instill that in you, your brother, everybody else, because there's only one place to look, which it's really interesting because the Bible is, there's no other God and there no false idols, and they immediately violate the fundamental principle of God by putting themselves in between. It's like you say, it's a complete hypocrisy and contradiction, but yet that's what they embrace. And if it still infiltrates you, there's a long tail on the effect that it has on the people that they damage early on. And you see it in your brother, and you see it in you as well. You have spent a lot of time teaching young people to think critically. Why is that so important to you?
I feel like it's evident probably, but I used to tell the students all the time, don't ever believe what I say. You can learn from what I say. Like, I'm going to give you some tools, but go verify it. And if I make a mistake in class, like later when people had cell phones, I would say, fact check me like right now and just correct me. Just tell me, hey, this, or, you do it respectfully, but say like, hey, this doesn't sound true. Maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I said it wrong because I was talking too fast or whatever. Like, I want to know if I made a mistake. And then I would tell them that when anybody tells you something, you need to find out how to verify it. And you need to verify it from more than one source because everyone is biased. I used to teach critical thinking across the curriculum to faculty members as well. And in fact, I taught some survival skills as critical thinking too, because there's a lot of things that we as humans are prone to when it comes to fear. And one of the things we can do when we are aware of our fear is learn techniques for calming ourselves down so we can think more critically. I think that teaching critical thinking, like learning all the just the logical fallacies, like some of them were like kind of like not silly, but fun, like post hoc ergo propter hoc, or like, I don't know, false dichotomies, but just to recognize them. We used to look at works of journalism and point out, I would have them find the logical fallacies in the stories that they were reading. And I said, if you can do that, like you don't have to judge the person who wrote it because sometimes they're telling the truth the best they can, but you can't take things as true just because someone says them. I don't care how important that person is. And I think that spending years teaching it really helped me understand that what incredible tool that I was given, I think, from the map making when I was a really little kid in school, but to be able to apply it to scripture, to do, to basically create my own sense of concordance and cross-referencing, like that was a survival tool as well. And so I don't think that surviving in the mountains is that useful for the average human in today's culture. Certainly Americans don't really have a lot of need for that, but the survival tool, critical thinking, is something that we need more than ever. Media literacy, all of it. And so to be able to bring that skill into real world practical application for young people was just like an obvious choice, I think, for me.
Oh, I think surviving in the mountains is about as close of a direct analogy to what people need to do in everyday life as you could possibly get. I mean, when I asked you about it and said, if we dropped you in the forest, what would you do? You said, well, the first thing I would do is not panic. How could anything be more relevant to urban life or corporate life? That would be the first rule you would tell people. This is crisis management 101. It doesn't matter if you're in the woods or you're in corporate America or you're in an urban situation where they dropped you in a back alley at midnight in Shanghai. I'm so glad that you can share that information with people.